talk to all y'all. I'm going to talk about a different sort of perspective on sustainability, so looking more from the animal welfare perspective, focusing on silvopasture systems. And silvopastures are a system where you deliberately integrate both trees, forage like grasses, and livestock on the same plot of land. And this serves multiple purposes. So the trees provide some benefits for the animals. The forage can be feed depending on what type of animals you house there. And the trees might also provide another source of income. So maybe as timber, or maybe if they're fruit growing trees, you can sell the fruits or use that as feed. So it's sort of using multiple approaches for the same plot of land. And the system is mostly being used in ruminants like cattle, but it is showing a lot of benefits for poultry as well, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Sustainability is a broad concept, as most of you will know, and a silvopasture system very nicely fits within a sustainability approach, because when we consider sustainability, we look at the animals, the people, and the environment. And if we consider a silvopasture system within the sustainability sort of lens, it can provide benefits for all three of these concepts. So a silvopasture can ensure or make it more likely that animals are happy and healthy, and that's sort of what I'm going to talk about today. It could provide extra income, as I said, for the producer from the trees or the product of the trees, and maybe even sell the animal products at a higher price because it's a free range outdoor product. So it could result in happier people with a healthier income. And then it has also shown to have some benefits for the environment, like trees help with carbon sequestration. So sustainability and silvopastures really go hand in hand and has the potential to sort of benefit all components. So today I'm going to focus on the animal side, as that's my expertise, and not so much on the other aspects, although I can comment on that a little bit. So just a little overview. We completed a silvopasture project last year that I'm going to talk about a little bit, show you the results of how silvopasture systems can benefit broiler chicken welfare. And then I want to touch upon agroforestry as a whole. Silvopasture is an example of an agroforestry practice and how it relates to avian influenza, because outdoor access means, as Dr. Rothrock said, access or exposure to these potential pathogens, and that includes avian influenza. All right, so for the silvopasture project, we had a project funded by the Southern SARE where we performed some experiments looking at the benefits of silvopastures for broiler chickens. In this case, these were fast-growing broilers, and we also assessed the impacts of these silvopasture systems at commercial farms. So we included 3 small-scale broiler farms and then 1 large-scale broiler producer that's from a larger integration. But today I'm just going to focus on what we found in those experiments and the field trials. Just to show you that it's not just me. These projects you cannot do alone, so there was a whole team of people who helped make this happen. So a little bit more information about the data we collected. As I said, we had 2 experiments that we run at Virginia Tech, where we compared an open pasture that you can see on the left to housing on a silvopasture, in this case with an older tree stand. And you can see in the pictures that the birds were housed in mobile coops that we moved around in these little plots. And then we also collected data from 3 small-scale producers. And these farms were very diverse. Maybe from the pictures you can already tell, but I'll highlight some differences to sort of illustrate the diversity of those farms and the experiment. So in the experiment, we used a Cornish cross that we assessed at 39 days of age. So these are those fast-growing broiler chickens that we took to production of until 42 days of age, while the small-scale farms, they used a slower growing strain. So on the farm on the left, they had a mixed breed. So it wasn't even a single strain. It was a mix of slow-growing broiler breeds that we assessed at 72 days of age. Then the farm in the middle had these very small flocks, only 2 of them that were housed in the sort of A-frame coops that you can see in the background. And they housed Freedom Rangers that we assessed at 63, between 63 and 67 days of age. And we repeatedly assessed flocks at that farm. So we have data from multiple years, but also from a plot of land where the birds did not have access to any trees compared to birds that did have some type of silvopasture stand. So they had some trees that they had a canopy cover to hide under. And then the third small scale farm was a farm that used Royal Greys. So another slow growing broiler breed that we assessed at 68 days of age. So you already see that there's some differences between these farms. Then the trees were different as well. So in the experiment, as I said, we compared the open grass pasture to pasture with about a 20-year-old stand with low to moderate canopy cover. So about 30% of the overhead cover was covered by leaves and trees for the birds, providing shade. And then the small scale farm on the left had a 30-year-old stand, so much denser and older than in the experiments or at the other farms. In the middle small scale farm, we had an open pasture plot and one with a few trees of which we do not know the age. And then the last small scale farm, we had a farm with about a 5-year-old stand that you can see in the picture as well. These were hazelnut trees or bushes, so much less canopy cover than in some of the others. So as you can see, a lot of variation between farms. So this doesn't really allow a thorough scientific comparison between all these conditions, but we can at least look at the animal welfare outcomes and see if we can see any sort of trends that can be related to how they are housed with or without trees. So for our animal welfare measures, we assessed an aspect of health, emotion, and behavior. In terms of health, we looked especially at foot pad and leg health because these are important sort of risks for broiler chickens, especially the fast-growing broiler chickens. A measure of emotion we used was looking at their fear. And then in terms of behavior, we looked at ranging behavior or how they used the range by just looking at how many birds were outside. And I'll give some more details about these measures as we go through it. So first, let's look at the effect or the association between silvopastures and bird leg health. As I said, we assessed footbed dermatitis, and we used this 5-point scoring system, where a score 0 was perfectly healthy footpads, no lesions, and a score 4 was most severe, where the majority of the footpad had lesions, necrotic skin, and injury. So you can sort of see in the pictures how the scale progresses to a worse conditioning. These footpad lesions are mainly due to prolonged contact with moisture and chemicals in the bedding. So the moisture softens their skin, making it sensitive to infection. And once these lesions get severe, so around a score 3 is theorized, the lesions will be painful for the birds. And they also serve as a gateway for secondary infection because now there's a wound on the bottom of their foot that can allow bacteria to enter the bloodstream and cause systematic infection. So a problem that can cause more problems. Then we also assess lameness by looking at the bird's gait. So lameness has a multifactorial causation. We didn't look at why these birds were lame. There's multiple reasons why it can happen. We do know that if birds are severely lame, again, this is a painful condition and especially problematic once they can no longer access feed or water, because then they will also stop growing and sort of enter that vicious cycle of a negative welfare state. We used a 0 to 2 scoring system where 0 is perfect gait, 1 is somewhat abnormal gait, and then 2 is a severely abnormal gait. All right, so let's look at some footbed dermatitis results. The graph shows you the number of birds within the category, so the proportion of birds that we assessed. And we grouped them by healthy foot pads, so no lesion present or a lesion present. So just 2 groups. And then we had that open pasture treatments with just grassland in maroon in the graph, and the silvopasture treatment, so the treatment with trees, in orange in the graph. And what you can see here is that there's fewer birds in the open pasture treatments in the healthy foot pad category, and therefore more birds in the foot pad lesion category compared to the silvopasture treatments. So what this tells us is that in these experiments, we saw a benefit for foot pad health for the silvopasture because more birds had healthy foot pads in the silvopasture treatments. If we look at our small scale farms, again, we cannot really make a scientific comparison, but we can at least look at some trends. Again, the open pasture is the maroon color, so that was on that second farm. And then we have the silvopasture in orange, the young silvopasture in gray, and the older, more dense silvopasture in blue in these graphs. And you can see a very similar trend to what we saw in the experiments, where the birds in the open pasture generally had worse foot pad health. So more birds were in the lesion group compared to the silvopasture treatments. Then the results for lameness. Again, first the results of our experiments. We grouped the birds in the healthy gait category, so a score 0, or a gait abnormality, a score 1 or 2. And we saw really no difference between our treatments. And what is interesting to note is that the gait really was excellent in both treatments, especially considering these were fast-growing broilers, the Cornish cross. If we look at the small-scale farms, we see a little bit of a different story. Here we see fewer birds in the open pasture group had healthy gaits compared to the birds from the silvopastures, and thus more birds in the gait abnormality, which sort of aligns a little bit with the footpad dermatitis results. Excuse me. So what we're seeing overall is that a lot of birds had perfect gaits. So the gait score or the presence of lameness was almost like not present. Lameness was almost not present in these birds, regardless of how they were housed in terms of pasture access. It looks like there's some improved gait in the silvopastures at the small scale farms, but again, we can only sort of look at this qualitatively. All right, then moving on to fear. So there our measure of emotion. We can measure fear by looking at the bird's tonic immobility. And this is a natural behavior that birds and other species will show when they are attacked by a predator. And we can induce this behavior by putting them in these cradles, as you can see in the picture, and sort of gently keep them there, puts very gentle pressure on their sternum and cup their head. This will induce this sort of innate fear response. They think they're going to be eaten, so we're pretending to be a predator in a way. And then they will stay in this immobile state for a while. And we can measure how long they stay immobile. And then we know from previous research that the longer they stay immobile, the greater fear they are experiencing. So they are more worried to be eaten. So they stay in this play dead state for longer. So in our experiments, we saw that the birds in the open pasture were more fearful than the birds in the silvopasture. So as you can see, their tonic immobility duration is slightly longer than in the silvopasture treatments. So we saw that the silvopasture treatment had a benefit on fear, reducing birds' fear. In the small scale farms, we saw something completely different. So we saw that at the one farm where they had open pasture and silvopasture, so the maroon and the orange, that was the second farm that I showed pictures of, birds were really not very fearful at all. And then we saw at the other two silvopasture farms that tonic immobility was much longer compared to the others. So they were much more fearful. So not really a clear picture, not even following the same trend as what we saw in the experiments, really some confusing results there that we cannot really draw conclusions from, which suggests that might be caused by other factors rather than just having access to a silvopasture versus not. Keep in mind that those farms were managed by different people. They were different genetic strains. They were at a different age. So there were a lot of factors sort of confounding these results. All right, then the impact of silvopastures on behavior. So we looked at specifically the range use in the experiments only of these fast-growing broilers. They had access to their range between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., and we observed how many birds were outside at a given time. What we found, not in terms of behavior, but in terms of microclimate that I wanted to highlight is that the presence of this canopy, so these trees, modulated the microclimates in these plots. And I think it's nicely illustrated in this graph. You can see the ups and downs of the outside temperature here presented in Celsius. And you can see the open pasture treatment in red and the silvopasture treatment in bluish green. And you can see that the open pasture line is always more extreme than the silvopasture line. So it's always higher and lower as the temperatures differ. So you can see that just the presence of those trees made the extremes less extreme. Overall, we saw that there were more birds outside in the silvopasture than in the open pasture. So about 15% of the flock was outside at any given time compared to 9%. Not a huge number of birds on the range, unfortunately. We saw that the birds' age improved range use. So we kept them outside from about 3 weeks of age, started recording the range use at 4 weeks. And we saw an increase in number of birds outside as the birds aged. We also saw a clear effect of time of day. In this graph, you can see that a lot of birds were outside early in the morning. So when we opened the door, basically half or more of the flock came outside. And then this number steeply declines as time goes and then slowly climbs again as it becomes later in the day again. We saw that outside temperatures were especially impactful on the range use. So on warm days, birds were more likely to be outside in the morning. On cool days, birds were more likely to be outside in the midday or afternoon. So assuming that they want to warm up a little. And actually, we found that age, time of day, and temperature had bigger impacts on the number of birds outside than actually the treatments or the pasture type, which suggests that we may have to fine-tune this silvopasture, maybe add more canopy coverage to stimulate more birds to come outside. And although we don't have data collected from these other farms, I did want to show you this sort of video, quote unquote, video of the third farm. So you can see that it is possible to get a lot of birds outside. One way they also stimulated these birds to come outside is by providing feed outside during the day. And you can see that the range, even though there was not a lot of canopy cover, was quite well used. All right, changing topics a little bit because I wanted to highlight avian influenza and the role that agroforestry or silvopastures can play here. Because I think anyone is and everyone is aware of the avian influenza problems currently existing around the world. And animal health is an aspect of animal welfare, of course, and also sustainability. So very much relevant for what we're talking about today. Taking the US-centric approach, because that's where I am. The highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak started, or the most recent outbreak started in 2022 and has not left the country since. To date, about 105 million birds have been impacted by this disease. You can see that nearly all states have been impacted, especially Iowa, the dark green, most birds are impacted. About 519 commercial flocks have been impacted to date and 680 backyard flocks. So this shows you that it's not just a problem for large-scale commercial integrators. Backyard flocks are just as much impacted or even more impacted by this disease. And anyone who's keeping up to date knows that not just poultry are impacted anymore. This avian influenza strain has jumped to mammals. So currently there are 494 confirmed cases to date in livestock in the United States. And this summer, even some human cases have been reported. So the most recent, as far as I'm aware, is in July. The fourth case of avian influenza infection was occurred in a person that came into contact with infected dairy cattle in Colorado. So not just poultry are at risk, livestock are at risk, pets are at risk, and people are at risk. So this is an important issue. I wanted to include some clinical signs. If you ever visit a livestock facility or have livestock or dairy cattle yourself, it's important to sort of identify these signs of disease. So a drop in feed intake, a drop in milk production, a drop in milk quality, so thickened milk or even no milk, and signs of respiratory infection are all indicators that there could be an avian influenza infection in cattle. So important to keep an eye on these symptoms. And then the symptoms in poultry are somewhat similar, besides the milk production, of course. You can see birds experiencing a fever about 24 hours before any other symptoms take place. Swelling of body parts can be common, discoloration of wattles and combs, respiratory signs like the nasal discharge or coughing or sneezing can be signs that there's an infection present. Lack of coordination, reduced activity, diarrhea, and then a drop in egg production and very high mortality rates are all signs that there's a highly pathogenic avian influenza infection going on. And it is important to note that this disease is notifiable in the United States. So by law, you have to report that this disease is present in a flock. So make sure to go to the relevant authorities if you do think that this is going on in your flock. But let's go back to the relationship between agroforestry and avian influenza, and more specifically, the modes of transmission, because that's where agroforestry can potentially play a role. Avian influenza can be transmitted through feces, droplets in the air, or if animals are ingesting or come in contact with infected meat. And we know that there are some very high risk species that can transmit this disease, especially migratory water birds. They are the most probable transmitters of this virus, and as I said, are identified as a high-risk species. Some examples are geese, ducks, swans, gulls, and lapwings. So you sort of want to avoid interaction between these type of birds and your flock. Excuse me. Then there's also some low risk species. These are considered low risk because they're not as vulnerable to the infection as the high risk birds. So they're less likely to contract it themselves, but they can still carry the virus because they might be exposed to this infected meat. So if they eat a bird that died from avian influenza, they'll carry that disease with them and potentially transmit it to a poultry flock. So even though it doesn't affect them too much, they're still considered a low risk species for this case, for this disease. And it's really not so clear if pest species play a big role in transmission of avian influenza. So rats or pigeons, there's not a lot known about how or what role they play. And we also don't know so much about how pasture design, or in other words, tree cover, silvopastures, in what way they play a role, besides what I'm going to show you now. As far as I know, there's one study that sort of investigated the relationship between canopy cover and avian influenza risk, or the transmission risk. And this is a pilot study by Dr. Bassman and colleagues, and I can share the link too, where they assessed 11 laying hen farms with different levels of canopy cover. So some farms had no trees in the pasture, so 0% woody cover, and then the highest level of canopy cover was 90%. And rather than looking at avian influenza itself, they observed wild birds in the pasture and in the surrounding area. So rather than looking, is there an actual infection taking place, or is there actual transmission going around, what are the risks of these birds accessing your flock? So they looked at wild birds on the ground or in the vegetation in these pastures and in the surrounding area, so the space near the pasture. And they did this for high risk and low risk bird species. What they found was that there was a impact of season where they saw more high-risk species observed in any of the areas in the spring rather than in the fall or the winter time. So there's a seasonality to when the birds are present. They did see an effect of woody cover in the pasture where they counted more high-risk birds in the open pastures, which were pastures considered when canopy cover was less than 5%. So they counted more high-risk wild birds in the pasture when there were very few trees present. Then looking at the farm surroundings, they saw a similar trend where there were more high-risk bird species in the area of the pasture when the area around the pasture was open, so very little vegetation versus half open, so about half of it was vegetated with bushes or trees. And then, as I said, they looked at high risk and low risk birds, and they really didn't see anything related to these low risk species. So they couldn't really identify any effects. So what are some of the implications of this? Well, waterfowl was the most common species they observed in these open ranges. And looking at their biology, that makes sense because they prefer areas with short grass and no bushes or trees because they're a prey species and that's how they ensure their own safety. They also travel in large groups, so they need this large open space. So this is implying that if you do not provide this short grass, but rather have bushes and woody vegetation in the pasture, it's less likely that these type of birds will land in the pasture. So very carefully, we can conclude that woody vegetation seemed to reduce the risk of these birds accessing the pasture, and that's reducing the risk of transmission of avian influenza, which is what we're trying to do. But it is important again to note this was just a pilot study. According to the authors themselves, the design was not ideally balanced, and it really needs to be replicated to ensure that their findings are representative of the real world. But I do think it's a very promising finding where we can see that we can hopefully prevent some of the high avian influenza transmission by providing this sustainable agriculture approach of providing trees in poultry pastures. If you take anything away from what I've spoken about today, is that silvopastures are a very nice example of a sustainable agriculture system, and they fit very well in that sort of holistic approach of one health or one welfare. And what we found in our studies that many aspects of broiler chicken welfare are improved under these housing systems. We saw improvements in leg health, we saw improvements in fear, and we saw some improvements in behavior in terms of range use. So really shows some promise in terms of sustainable agriculture, and then especially looking at it from an animal welfare lens. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about this. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for that excellent presentation, Dr. Jacobs. I know we have a few questions already in the Q&A, and just as a reminder to all the attendees, if you have questions, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A so we can make sure we get those addressed. So we can start off with our first question here in the Q&A, which was how often and what kinds of predators or even birds of prey were present in the areas of the farm? And maybe if you noticed even differences between like open pasture and your silvopasture farms.
Yeah, so in our study, we didn't do like a formal assessment of predator threat or presence. We were very lucky that we did not have much predator pressures at all in our farms, and even on the small scale farms, they did not report a lot of predation. We had two experiments, as I said, and in our second experiment, at about like 2 days before processing date, we had one predator attack of possibly raccoons going for one of the plots. So predators are definitely a risk, especially in these sort of pasture-based systems where you have a mobile house that is maybe less protective than like a real poultry house. So I think the small scale farmers have found ways to sort of prevent this predation. The second farm that I showed you, they had protective geese to protect the flock, at least from daytime predators, because they will sound the alarm. Lighting, electric fencing, making sure that fences are dug in. If it's a permanent fence, there's a ton of strategies that people can take to prevent predation. But yeah, it's definitely a risk that is present and that we experience ourselves as well.
Great. Thank you. Those are great tips on how to strategies to think about mitigating predation. I was curious for the silvopasture, is there a minimum canopy that's required, like a minimum canopy cover that's required for a system to be considered silvopasture? And if there's no requirement, do you have like a recommendation based off on your experience of what you kind of think a minimum sort of should be, or what how we can start to see benefits from that canopy cover?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, and that's something that we sort of, as you know, with research, you get an answer and you get 10 new questions after completing research. That is one of the questions we sort of ended with is how much canopy cover is enough? In our experiment, we had roughly about 30% canopy cover. We saw some benefits for animal welfare, but in terms of range use, we didn't see the sort of improvement that we wanted to see. So that is suggesting that 30% canopy cover might not be enough. Um, in our design, we had old trees, right? Like 40 or was it like 20-year-old stand. So having some lower canopy cover, like from bushes basically, might benefit because birds feel safe hiding under bushes. And you saw it also in the sort of the hazelnut planted silvopasture, so that they hide under those bushes. So I think adding a variation of canopy heights, including some bushes, so low canopy height, higher canopy height. If I have to put a number out there, let's say 50%, but that's not based on any uh, research, but that would be very interesting to find out. It's like at what point does it really benefit the birds? How much do they need?
Totally. I like that thought too of having the different heights and giving birds choice in their environment of kind of what type of shelter, I guess, they want to interact with as well.
Mhm.
And I think building off of that idea of thinking about the type of canopy that's there, do you think there's any sort of added benefits or even risks to welfare if that canopy is something that's more of like a productive orchard, like a hazelnut orchard versus just kind of an existing established forest area?
Yeah, there are some potential benefits, especially if the fruits of the trees are edible for the birds. So they would enjoy, for instance, an apple orchard if they can like eat some of those fallen apples. And I know in some places that is a combination that is used. So a fruit orchard combination with poultry, maybe more commonly laying hens than broiler chickens, but I don't see why it wouldn't work for them. Yeah, it could provide additional income for the producer, right? The fruits, but also additional feed for the birds. So I can see a benefit there.
Awesome. All right. So then going to another question from our Q&A. In the measurement of fear response, did you ask about ask or measure the owner engagement with the various flocks? So for example, in a confinement, birds in an indoor house might have owners that walk the house more frequently and then be less flighty. So was that something that you took into consideration with your fear metrics?
Yeah, that's a great point, and that is what we also considered. Again, it's not formally included in the sort of analysis, but we definitely talked to the farmers or the farm managers about how they manage their flocks, and that could definitely be a main reason of why we saw these differences. And just looking at the differences of how the farms were managed, those with the older silvopastures, the farmer might not be present or close to the birds as much as with the other farms or in our experiments. Also, if the space is bigger, like in that hazelnut pasture or in the other pasture, birds can move away from people more. So giving them more space because it's a larger flock. This was a flock of about 1,500 birds, while in our experiment we had 50 birds per plots. Um, and then the second farm we had, or the people had about 80 birds per flock. So that's a whole different way of managing the birds, much more close contact between humans and animals. So yeah, that's a great point, and that's probably why these birds at the 5-year-old and 30-year-olds silvopastures were much more fearful.
Yeah, great observations and great question.
Mm.
Um, okay, next we have do you think that if we provide extra enrichment items outside, if that would increase the range use?
Also a great question. I think yes. So what we saw with the farm in Minnesota, what I showed the video, as I said, they have feed outside, so that already will stimulate birds to come outside. More cover, artificial or natural, will likely stimulate birds to go outside more. If they have access to water outside, that'll stimulate them to be outside more. But you also have to consider what other animals that might attract. So enrichments outside could be beneficial for the birds, but feed outside, if that attracts pest species or wild birds, that might not be ideal. So, in short, yes, provide more resources outside, and that'll stimulate birds to go outside. But yeah, keep in mind what other animals might be attracted by it. So maybe take that in consideration when you provide these things and what you'll provide outside.
Excellent. That's a great point. All right. Then I have sort of a two-part question here that's really thinking about artificial intelligence and ways that we might be able to use AI and kind of thinking about management. So, sort of the first question, first part of this question is thinking about sort of being able to have poultry expertise available in combination with AI. So, the question is sort of having an expert like yourself that could be accessible 24/7 through an AI system. So that would allow chicken farmers in different regions of the world to actually access expertise real time. So that's kind of the first part of the question of maybe, yeah, combining like AI as a tool with poultry expertise so that poultry farmers can access resources more readily. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I love that idea. I'd love someone who's more technology savvy to develop that. I'm happy to contribute my sort of expertise in that. Yeah, I think that would be a great idea. And it might be the future. Just need to put the right people together to make that happen.
Yeah, that would be a great way to reach even a more global audience. And then their second question about AI is thinking about sort of using it as like a management tool. So they asked about using AI to do automated analysis and interventions of bird activity. And they said that currently like the way you're measuring bird activity is more manual rather than sort of using something more automated. So do you think there are any emerging technologies or AI-driven solutions that could be used for more automated measuring of behavior and sort of increase efficiency of assessing behavior and welfare challenges?
Hmm. Yeah, great point. And short answer, yes. So the technology is coming. it's being developed as we speak. There's a lot of research going on right now with machine learning, smart technology, trying to make this sort of manual process more automated. So yes, it exists to an extent. Researchers are working on it. It might be already available on a commercial scale at a limited fashion, but it comes with a lot of it requires a lot of development to make it broadly applicable. So in these research studies, you'll see that they have to fine tune this technology specifically to their specific conditions that they use it in, have to train the system, and then it shows some really promising results in terms of um, automatically recording flock activity, following individual birds around, identifying which birds are where, how many birds are eating at a time, how many birds are sleeping, drinking, using perches, for instance. So all these technologies are to an extent already here. Now it's just scaling them to that anyone can use them, that you don't have to really do one big experimental or research study to make it applicable for your farm or your conditions, but make it broader applicable for the greater audience in a way. And yeah, even myself, I cannot wait for these things to become more available to make our lives as behavioral researchers easier instead of having to be there to manually record bird activity. Now we can then just use camera vision, for instance, and machine learning to do that automatically. So maybe in 5 to 10 years, it's everywhere, but it's definitely being developed right now.
Excellent. And then for our last question here, also in the Q&A box, thinking about the devastating impact of avian influenza, and I know you touched on AI, that type of AI, switching AI types here in your talk as well. And this person is asking, given your expertise and observations with avian influenza, what is your perspective on the potential for, AI outbreaks to repeat and cause these devastating losses? What measures could be taken to mitigate the risk? And yeah, sort of what are your general thoughts on that?
Repeat infection, I cannot uh, answer. I really have no idea there, but prevention, biosecurity. Biosecurity is really the only way we have any control over preventing, and then still, it could still happen because it is airborne, right? It can be transmitted through particles in the air. So you cannot stop air from contacting your birds. But limiting the risk through biosecurity is really the thing that we should do, and probably the only thing we can do at this point until vaccinations are readily available. So separating your birds from wild birds, um, wearing designated clothing, shoes, when you enter the barn that doesn't potentially have fecal material from wild birds underneath the shoes, for instance. Washing your hands, dedicated tools, things like that that don't come into contact, disinfecting, sanitizing, keeping people that are in contact with other birds away from your birds for at least 72 hours, like all these types of sort of practical ways to reduce the risk of this transmission. Those are just ways we can try to prevent this from happening. But yeah, it's hard to manage. It's all over the world. So it's yeah, it's really a big problem.